Our next speaker is Alfred McCoy. He's a J.R.W. Smail Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The CIA attempted unsuccessfully to block the publication of his first book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. Today, this book is regarded as the classic study of global drug trafficking and has been translated into 9 foreign languages, most recently Thai and German. His book, A Question of Torture, CIA Interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror, provided the historical dimension for the film Taxi to the Dark Side, which won the Oscar in 2008 for Best Documentary. His recent book, Policing America's Empire, the United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State, won the George McT Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. It draws together 2 strands, covert actions and modern Philippine history, to explore the transformative power of the police, information, and scandal in shaping both the modern Philippine state and U.S. internal security apparatus. In 2012, last year, he was lead editor in publishing Endless Empire, Spain's Retreat, Europe's Eclipse, America's Decline, which was the culmination of a decade-long collaborative investigation into imperial transitions by a global network of 140 scholars. In 2012, the Yale Graduate School awarded him the Wilbur Cross Medal, which recognizes distinguished achievements in scholarship, teaching, academic administration, and public service. His current work explores the role of the covert netherworld, an invisible social network inhabited by criminal syndicates and secret services in shaping the politics of the modern state and their world order. And I'm sure many, many of us, if not all of us, are familiar with his writings in Time Dispatch. The title of his presentation tonight is The Rocket's Red Glare, Space Warfare, Cyberspace, and the Future of U.S. Global Power. Please join me in welcoming Al McCoy.
My profession, the history profession, has a miserable record in predicting the future. Not only do we get it wrong, but we usually get it comically wrong. As an historian, when it's over, I will tell you not only what happened, but with magisterial certainty and brilliant insight, exactly why it happened. But when it comes to the future, I am, like all of you, guessing. So, after 40 years on a lecture podium, what I'm going to present, and because I've been trained to do my job, and hopefully I do it well, it'll have an authoritative ring, but it's just the future. It's speculative, it's interpretive, it's reading those tea leaves just like all of you. So with that caveat, let me now begin. In January of 2010, President Barack Obama delivered the State of the Union address that warned Congress and the country of serious challenges to America's global power, saying, China is not waiting to revamp its economy, Germany is not waiting, India is not waiting, these nations aren't playing for second place. Then, in a rhetorical flourish that brought forth thunderous bipartisan applause from Congress, President Obama announced, well, I do not accept second place for the United States of America. Echoing those words a few days later, Vice President Joseph Biden rejected the possibility of U.S. decline, saying, and I quote, we will continue to be the most significant and dominant influence in the world as long as our economy is strong. But, just last December, the U.S. National Intelligence Council, our nation's supreme analytic body, took a diametrically different position by predicting, and I quote, by 2030, Asia will have surpassed North America and Europe combined in terms of global power, largely reversing the historic rise of the West since 1750. Why, we might well ask, is America's relative economic decline so precipitous, happening so quickly? To answer that unanswerable question, the National Intelligence Council reduced the complexities of this very complex historical transition to just 2 PowerPoint slides. The most telling of these slides shows that Britain increased its share of global gross domestic product, or GDP, by just 1% per decade from 1820 to 1870. America raised its share by 2% from 1900 to 1950, and Japan just a bit more than 1% from 1950 to 1980. But China is raising its slice of the world pie at an extraordinarily rapid rate of 5% from 2000 to 2020, and India is not far behind. With America's dominion now being debated at the highest levels, it seems timely to ask, first, what kind of empire is this American imperium? And second, what kind of plans does our Pentagon have for extending America's global reach deep into the 21st century? To fill the void, I would argue the vast void, between the enormity of America's empire and the paucity of its study, 10 years ago, a working group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison formed a network of 140 scholars from 4 continents, which published a volume just last October titled Endless Empire, and that volume asks, what can the eclipse of 5 European overseas empires tell us about the future of U.S. global power? Through this exercise in comparative imperial history, we went beyond the usual iron binary of economic and military power to identify 5 factors that might influence the decline of U.S. global power. First factor, waning economic influence. At the broadest level, the rapid decline of Europe's empires after World War II was driven by their diminished economic strength. Empires are expensive, very expensive. Without the revenues and armed forces that are almost organic to a conventional contiguous state, empires must somehow find the extraordinary funds to sustain the enormous expense of their overseas operations. Exhausted by World War II and faced with rising social welfare costs, post-war Great Britain suffered a crippling post-war economic contraction that denied her the ability to defend her vast global empire. Within just 20 years, from 1945 to 1965, the number of overseas subjects under the British flag dropped from 700 million to just 5 million. Indeed, there are parallel signs of a slow U.S. economic decline. 2 years ago, in 2011, the International Monetary Fund predicted that China would become the world's #1 economy in just 5 years, with its share of gross world output surging to 18% by 2016, while America's share would, it was predicted, slide to an historic low of 17%, far below its peak of almost 50% back in 1950. Compounding this gross decline in its global economic power, America's social welfare costs will rise from 4% of gross domestic product in 2010 to 18% by 2050, confronting Washington with the same choice between domestic welfare and global power that forced London's imperial retreat back in the 1950s. Second factor in Europe's imperial decline, micro-military misadventures. Not only must an empire secure such scarce resources, but it must expend them wisely, literally picking its battles. During the demoralizing process of decline, imperial armies, so lethal, so rational during an empire's ascent, can err by plunging into draining, even disastrous micro-military misadventures, which are psychologically compensatory efforts to salve the stinging loss of power by occupying new territories whose symbolism often exceeds any real economic or strategic value. At midpoint in its 20-year imperial retreat, such crippling psychological pressures led Great Britain to throw its full military might against Gamal Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, producing a quick military victory that became within days an humiliating diplomatic defeat, a defeat that marked for everyone a sign that the British Empire was truly dead. As Washington withdraws in defeat from Afghanistan, the invasion of Iran beckons as the graveyard of U.S. global power that might prove a micro-military disaster on the scale of Suez. Third factor, relations with foreign powers. Between the bounds of these economic and military fundamentals, no empire is sustainable without astute statecraft, both diplomacy to court peers and dominance to control subordinate elites. As London's power faded, its close U.S. ally pushed Britain out of one strategic area after another, first Iran, then Suez, later the Persian Gulf, taking control of British oil assets and naval bases as they went. In November 2010, when President Obama flew back from visiting Asian allies, the New York Times summed up Washington's waning influence with its allies in a painfully blunt front-page headline, which, by the way, has since been taken down from the website. You can't find it. I guess it was too harsh, but too true. Quote, Obama's economic view is rejected on world stage. China, Britain, and Germany challenge U.S. Trade talks with Seoul fail too. Fourth factor, nexus of subordinate elites. At its peak circa 1900, Great Britain's rule over Asia and Africa was stitched together by the gossamer threads of personal relations with local leaders, stretching from Fiji Island chiefs to Malay sultans, Indian maharajas to West African emirs. The British imperial historian Ronald Robinson famously argued that British imperial rule ended, quote, when colonial rulers had run out of indigenous collaborators, with the result that the inversion of collaboration into non-cooperation largely determined the timing of decolonization. After World War II, decolonization elevated the locus of control from those colonial districts to new national capitals, making the leaders of the world's 100 emerging nations Washington's new coterie of so-called subordinate elites. In 2010, after WikiLeaks started releasing those 251,000 recent U.S. diplomatic cables, I haven't read all of them yet, I assure you, rich in insights about U.S. relations with these subordinate elites, the influential Israeli journalist Aluf Ben wrote, quote, the cables depict the fall of the American empire, the decline of a superpower that once ruled the world by dint of its military and economic supremacy. Fifth and final factor, military information. Among the most important aspects of empire, imperial information systems are critical for securing accurate intelligence about when and how to apply lethal force rationally and effectively. Now, while British colonial policy was influenced by deep, particularistic Orientalist knowledge, exemplified by those famous Arabists T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell, America developed a distinctive imperial epistemology, a distinctive system of imperial knowledge that applies universal systems to amass superficial, serviceable data. In sum, we now seem faced with two possible scenarios about the future of U.S. global power. As predicted in that 2012 report by the U.S. National Intelligence Council, the relentless shift of world economic strength from west to east, from America to China, might lead to a slow, inexorable decline in U.S. global power. Alternatively, a sort of technological Hail Mary's pass in the form of a new robotic information regime just might allow Washington the exercise of global power in excess of economic strength, breaking that iron binary between financial resources and military strength and extending the American century to 2050 or so or beyond. Now, with analysts scrutinizing every detail of U.S. economic trends over the short, medium, and long term, we need to focus on that second scenario by exploring America's distinctive imperial epistemology, that is, the way America manages the data for the exercise of global power. Now, in the past century, as 3 U.S. pacification campaigns in Asia have dragged out for a decade or more, skirting defeat if not disaster, the U.S. military has been pushed to the breaking point and responded by fusing extant technologies into an information infrastructure of unprecedented power, thereby producing a new regime for data management. First, the manual regime during the Philippine War from 1898 to 1907. Next, the computerized regime during the Vietnam War from 1963 to 75. And most recently, the robotic regime in Afghanistan and Iraq from 2003 to perhaps 2014. Now, to foreshadow what follows, this succession of information regimes leads to ambiguous conclusions about the future of U.S. global power. On the one hand, this information infrastructure seems to have a kind of inbuilt engineering for self-correction that makes every defeat, every reverse, no matter how searing, how traumatic in the historical moment, an experiment that leads to important innovations, to progress. On the other hand, this infrastructure's preference for superficial data over deep cultural knowledge about foreign societies creates self-referential information loops that can foster illusions with a potential for some future micromilitary disaster. So let's now review these regimes. Let's start first with the information regime, the manual information regime during the Philippine-American War. This is something I described in my recent book, Policing America's Empire. The U.S. system of imperial knowledge traces its origin to a synergy of innovations in the management of textual, statistical, and visual data that during the 1870s and the 1880s created the capacity for the surveillance of the many rather than a few, a defining attribute, in my view, of a modern state. Let's listen as the dates sing to us a cappella a song of progress. The synergy of Thomas Edison's quadruplex telegraph, 1874, Philo Remington's commercial typewriter, 1874, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, 1876, allowed the transmission and recording of textual data in unprecedented quantities at unequaled speed with unsurpassed accuracy. Simultaneously, Melville Dewey's discovery of the smart number, embodied in his Dewey Decimal System, reduced otherwise unmanageable masses of data to alphanumeric codes for rapid filing, retrieval, and cross-referencing. After engineer Herman Hollerith patented the punch card, 1889, the U.S. Census Bureau adapted his electrical tabulating machine in 1890 to enumerate 62 million Americans within just weeks, a stunning success that later led engineer Hollerith to become one of the founders of the International Business Machines Corporation, best known by its acronym IBM. But on the eve of empire in 1898, Congress, courts, and civil society still barred any federal application of these innovations to internal security, leaving ample room for the modernization of America's weak patchwork state that came with a stunning decade in the imperial decade that followed. Now, in contrast to British colonials who headed east beyond Suez to probe ancient texts for a timeless Orientalist essence to guide their colonial policy, American imperialists went west across the Pacific to survey the Philippine present through the new information technologies of census, mapping, meteorology, photography, taxonomy, and surveillance. To pacify protracted Philippine resistance that continued for a decade after 1898, the U.S. regime elaborated its information technologies into a three-tier security apparatus: the U.S. Army's Division of Information, the Manila Police, and the Philippines Constabulary. Let's look at each of these very briefly. First, the Division of Military Information. In December 1900, the U.S. Army established the Division of Military Information in the Philippines, creating the U.S. Army's first field intelligence unit in its 100-year history. After assuming the command of this fledgling unit in early 1901, an obscure officer, Captain Ralph Van Diemen, later known as the father of U.S. military intelligence, collected comprehensive data on the Filipino elite, every single politically active Filipino in every municipality, recording appearances, finance, property, kinship, and political loyalties. Second, Manila Police. During its 3-year pacification of Manila, 1898 to 1901, the U.S. Army also established a metropolitan police force for the city that within just 20 years amassed photographic files for over 70% of the city's total population of 200,000. Finally, the Philippines Constabulary. Only weeks after taking office in July 1901, the first U.S. civil governor of the Philippines, William Howard Taft, established the Philippines Constabulary as a colonial panopticon whose intelligence flowed into its centralized information division, where it was translated, typed, numbered, and filed in dossiers for ready retrieval and cross-referencing. Now, the creation of this powerful colonial police would prove mutually transformative, making the constabulary an arm of the Philippine presidential power throughout the 20th century and leaving a lasting institutional imprint on the emerging American state. Drawing upon security methods he developed in the colonial Philippines, Colonel Ralph Van Diemen founded the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Division in 1917, recruiting a staff that quickly grew from one himself, to 1,700, deploying some 300,000 citizen operatives to amass over 1 million pages of typed surveillance reports on U.S. citizens in just 14 months, and laying the foundations for a domestic surveillance apparatus that persists to the present. Now, this first largely manual information regime reached its apotheosis during World War II when Washington established the Offices of Strategic Services, or the OSS, as the nation's first worldwide espionage agency. Among this new agency's 9 branches, the Research and Analysis branch recruited a staff of nearly 2,000 academics, many of them very famous indeed, who amassed 300,000 photographs, 1 million maps, 3 million file cards, which are deployed via indexing, cross-indexing, and counter-indexing to produce over 3,000 staff studies and answer countless tactical questions. Yet by early 1944, the OSS found itself, in the words of one historian of this unit, quote, drowning in a flow of information, with many of the materials it had collected so carefully stacking up in storage unread and unprocessed. In its global reach, this manual information regime, absent technological change, might have eventually collapsed under its own weight, imposing some limits on America's voracious imperial epistemology. Then came the second computerized information regime during the Vietnam War. Now, under the pressures of a protracted war in Indochina from 1964 to 1974, the U.S. information infrastructure made rapid strides in computerized data management whose sum was nothing less than a second American information regime. Let's look at a few of these efforts at computerized pacification. First and fundamentally, the CIA's Phoenix program tried to catalyze a potent synergy of computerized data collection and localized coercion that would, in theory, sweep the Viet Cong guerrillas from the village of South Vietnam, but instead developed a self-referential data loop that affected 41,000 extrajudicial killings without ever capturing a single high-ranking Viet Cong. In a parallel effort, the U.S. Command conducted a monthly survey for the Hamlet Evaluation System, rating the loyalties for all of South Vietnam's 12,000 villages on an IBM dot matrix map with an illusory precision. After Defense Secretary McNamara told the CIA in late 1966 to, quote, design me something that will tell us the status of control in the countryside, agency analysts identified 18 variables that allowed U.S. military advisors to assess every month the security situation in 12,000 hamlets on a 5-point scale from A, secure, to E, Viet Cong control. Every month, MACV's powerful IBM computers translated these reports into a consolidated security report arrayed on a dot matrix computer map in illusory visual icon of spreading U.S. control over the villages of South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese population rated secure climbed relentlessly to 75% pacified on the eve of the 1968 Tet Offensive and 84% pacified on the eve of the fall of Saigon in 1974. In the end, automated indices led South Vietnam's government, said CIA Director William Colby, quote, to delude itself about its standing with its own people. But most ambitiously of all, the U.S. Air Force applied innovative computer systems under Operation Igloo White to build an electronic battlefield of sensors to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in southern Laos. From 1967 to 1973, the U.S. Air Force expended nearly $1 billion a year to lace southern Laos with a network of 20,000 acoustic, seismic, thermal, and ammonia-sensitive sensors to locate truck convoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Through an hermetic data loop, the Air Force claimed destruction of an incredible 25,000 North Vietnamese trucks from October 1970 to May 1971 for a total of 80% of all trucks destroyed, a claim belied by Hanoi's reports of only 15% loss and the CIA's complimentary estimate of just 20% destroyed. Then, after 100,000 North Vietnamese troops with tanks, artillery, and trucks passed right through this electronic grid undetected to launch the Win Hue offensive in 1972, the U.S. Air Force's Pacific Command pronounced the effort a failure. During the war, the Air Force also accelerated development of unmanned aircraft by adopting the dumb Ryan Firebee target drone for unmanned aerial vehicles that launched some 3,500 surveillance sorties over southern China, North Vietnam, and Laos. Significantly, both space and cyber warfare are new unregulated domains of military conflict, beyond the rubric of international law, that Washington can use as Archimedean levers for the exercise of global dominion, just as the British Navy once ruled the seas and the U.S. Air Force once controlled the skies. Although U.S. aerospace plans remain classified, we can, I think, infer something of its shape from the specifications for its components that the Pentagon will, by 2020, deploy. It will deploy a triple canopy space shield reaching from stratosphere to exosphere, patrolled by drones armed with agile missiles, linked by a resilient modular satellite system, and operated through a telescopic panopticon. Let's look at the emerging shape of this triple canopy aerospace regime. First, in the lower stratosphere. In the lowest tier of the aerospace shield, within striking distance of the Earth, the Pentagon is building an armada of 99 Global Hawk drones equipped with high-resolution cameras to surveil all terrain within a 100-mile radius, electronic sensors to intercept communications, efficient engines for continuous 24-hour flight, and eventually triple Terminator missiles to destroy targets below. By late 2011, the Air Force and CIA had ringed the entire Eurasian landmass with a network of 60 bases for Reaper drones armed with Hellfire missiles, allowing airstrikes against targets almost anywhere in Africa and Asia. Next, upper stratosphere. At the next tier above the Earth, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, and the U.S. Air Force are collaborating in the development of the Falcon hypersonic cruise vehicle that, flying at 20 miles altitude, can deliver 12,000 pounds of payload at a distance of 9,000 nautical miles from the continental United States in less than 2 hours. Although the first test launches in April 2010 and August 2011 crashed mid-flight, they achieved 22 times the speed of sound and sent back unique data to resolve remaining aerodynamic problems. Finally, the exosphere. At the outer level of this triple-tier aerospace canopy, the age of space warfare dawned in April 2010 when the Pentagon quietly launched the X-37B space drone. How many people here noted that event? Okay, one amongst a group that pays attention to these things. Two, okay? So, quietly, a very quiet launch. This was an unmanned aircraft, just 29 feet long, and it took an orbit 250 miles above the Earth. By the time the second X-37B prototype landed at Vandenberg Air Force Base in June 2012, after a flawless 15-month flight, this classified mission represented the successful test of robotically controlled reusable spacecraft and established the viability of unmanned space drones in the exosphere, the outermost level of the Pentagon's emerging three-tier canopy. At the apex of this triple canopy, where space drones and Terminator missiles roam, orbital satellites are the primary targets, a vulnerability that became painfully obvious in 2007 when China used a ground-air missile to shoot down one of its own satellites. In response, DARPA is now developing the F-6 satellite that will, to quote its website, decompose a large monolithic spacecraft into a group of wirelessly linked elements or nodes that increases resistance to a bad part breaking or an adversary attacking. And the X-37B has a capacious cargo bay to carry triple Terminator missiles to knock out enemy satellites should that be necessary. Ultimately, the impact of this third technological regime will be shaped by the integration of this aerospace array into a robotic command structure that will coordinate operations across all combat domains: space, cyberspace, sky, sea, subsea, and earth. For a new global optic, DARPA is building the Wide-Angle Space Surveillance Telescope for a quantum leap in space surveillance that will one day allow future space warriors seated at a single console to see the entire sky wrapped around the Earth and track every object in the Earth's orbit. Operation of this complex worldwide apparatus will require, as one DARPA official explained in 2007, an integrated collection of space surveillance systems and architecture that is leak-proof. Thus, by 2010, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency had 16,000 employees, a $5 billion budget, and a massive $2 billion headquarters at Fort Belvoir with 8,500 staffers wrapped in electronic security, all aimed at coordinating the flood of worldwide surveillance data pouring in from Predators, Reapers, U-2 spy planes, Global Hawks, X-37 space drones, Google Earth, space surveillance telescopes, and orbiting satellites. Looking forward into the future, a still uncertain balance of forces provides us with two competing scenarios for the future of U.S. global power. By 2020, the Pentagon will complete a comprehensive global surveillance system that might, just might, allow Washington to exercise global power in excess of economic strength, blinding any army on the battlefield or vaporizing individual insurgents in field or favela. History, however, offers some pessimistic precedents about the U.S. chances to preserve its global hegemony by military technology alone. Even if this robotic information regime somehow checks China's growing military power, the U.S. might have the same chance of controlling wider geopolitical forces with robotic technology that, say, the Third Reich had of winning World War II with superweapons such as the V-2 rocket or the Me-262 jet fighter. Complicating the future even further, the illusion of information omniscience might incline Washington to more military misadventures akin to Vietnam or Iraq, creating the possibility of some new global miasma with untold potential for micro-military disaster. Whether U.S. world dominion will be marked by expansion, stasis, or decline, America's attempt to exercise global reach and excessive economic strength will likely be based in coming decades on some iteration of its distinctive form of imperial information. Thank you.